Jane Eyre is a classic novel written by Charlotte Bronte in 1847. I mistakenly pronounced it Ira in a previous video. I apologize for my Jane error.
Arglefonf Book Review, Arglefonf Book Review.
Jane Eyre is a gloomy 10-year-old girl who likes to look at dead and bleak landscapes. She's an orphan with no memory of her parents, and she lives with cruel relatives called the Reeds. Her cousin John likes to insult her and hit her. When Jane fights back, Mrs. Reed punishes her by locking her in a room all day. Jane furies against the unjust nature of the world. Mrs. Reed will always love everything her children do, no matter how awful, while she will always hate everything Jane does, no matter how good. Jane thinks about Mr. Reed, who died in this room. When she sees a gleam of light, she panics, thinking it's the ghost of Mr. Reed. She begs to be let out of the room, but Mrs. Reed thinks Jane is faking in order to escape being punished. Jane's shock gets worse, to the point where she collapses unconscious and a doctor has to be brought in. The doctor believes she has bad nerves and recommends that Jane be sent to boarding school. Mrs. Reed waits 3 months before following his advice. I'm not sure why. Mrs. Reed clearly hates Jane and doesn't want anything to do with her. You'd think Mrs. Reed would jump at the chance to never see Jane again. Mr. Brocklehurst comes to interview Jane for school. Mrs. Reed sours the interview by saying Jane is a liar and a deceiver. Jane is furious about these false accusations. She later gives a long speech on how much she hates Mrs. Reed and why. It's kind of a shame that Jane is not so bold and direct for the rest of the book. She's going to come across a pretty big mystery with lots of deception. I kept waiting for Jane to stand up for herself and demand an explanation, which would match the way she acts in this first part of the book. She goes to Lowood Academy, a charity school for orphans. It's a cruel place with strict rules. Jane befriends an older girl named Helen Burns, who is often punished for being slattern. Jane cannot understand why Helen doesn't stand up for herself and resist unfair punishments. Helen explains it's because she's a Christian who tries her best to love her enemies. Mr. Brocklehurst occasionally comes to inspect the school. He gives rude, self-righteous lectures on how the girls are being spoiled rotten, when it's clear these girls are being deprived. For example, the porridge is so badly burnt, the girls can't eat it. Mr. Brocklehurst thinks they should be glad to get inedible food. The only good thing about Lowood Academy is the kind Miss Temple, who tries her best to help the girls. There is a large typhus outbreak that year. Jane is there when Helen dies happily, knowing she shall be united with God. At this point, Jane realizes that the story has been moving way too slowly. It's chapter 10, and she's still 10 years old. She rushes through the next 8 years of her life, to when she gets a job as a governess at Thornfield Hall. This is when the book starts for real. If you want to skip the first 100 pages of the book, I won't tell on you. Jane arrives at Thornfield. She mostly spends her time with Miss Fairfax, who runs the house, and Adele Varens, the French child that she's tutoring. Jane tries learning about Mr. Rochester, the master of Thornfield, with no success. Jane quickly becomes bored with Thornfield and lectures readers on how the human heart cannot be satisfied with tranquility. Her desire for excitement is fulfilled when she meets a stranger on the road. She helps him when his horse slips on some ice. They talk for a while, and he seems like a nice man. He asks her some questions about Mr. Rochester. It turns out this man is Mr. Rochester. He was just pretending to be someone else. I don't want to be mean and say I liked Mr. Rochester better when he was pretending to be a totally different person, but he was a lot nicer when pretending to be a stranger. He quickly assumes his normal manner, which is a mixture of gloomy and angry. He gives Jane a job interview, which is harsh and abrupt. Fairfax assures Jane that eventually she'll get used to Mr. Rochester's strange ways, and he won't seem rude anymore. She's correct, but it's not exactly a ringing endorsement. Jane's first real conversation with Mr. Rochester is long and confusing. Like, he'll ask a question, then talk about her response, with special emphasis on the way she responded, and how this allows him to make general conclusions about her, especially after he compares and contrasts her responses with previous responses she gave, which, of course, must be judged against the responses that one would normally expect to receive, which in turn must be analyzed with acknowledgement of the peculiarities and mannerisms of the respondent and responder, which, quite naturally, affect the standards of normality to which normal responses adhere. Which is to say, what? It's also hard to follow the conversation because Mr. Rochester keeps referencing some tragedy in his past without saying what it is. It's sort of like, I had a terrible experience in my youth. What happened? It was tragic and I'll never recover. What happened? It turned my life into a living nightmare from which I still cannot escape. When are you going to tell me what happened? 180 pages from now, when I'm legally required to do so. Why would I tell you earlier? In the next chapter, Rochester explains part of his tragic backstory. 10 years ago, he fell in love with a French opera singer. He was heartbroken to learn she only liked him for his money, and she cheated on him the whole time. The woman claims that Adele is their child. Mr. Rochester doesn't believe it, which is why he's basically ignoring Adele's existence by putting her in this out-of-the-way property that he never visits. He's almost as much of a villain as the Reeds. Wait, he's not the villain of the novel? He is Jane's love interest? Are you kidding me? He's over twice as old as she is. That's just sick and wrong. And besides, he treats her really badly. He's always insulting her. Yes, it's clear he likes talking to her because they have similar gloomy mindsets, but even then, the conversations are pretty one-sided. It's more like he's talking at her, and it amuses him to hear her responses, but he doesn't like listening to her. She's never the one who leads the conversation. She spent 100 pages telling readers about her life at age 10, but I'm pretty sure she never said a word of that to Mr. Rochester, because she never gets to pick what they talk about, and he doesn't care about her past. That night, Jane hears a demonic laugh from outside her bedroom. She wakes up to see somebody has set Mr. Rochester's room on fire. She saves his life and helps put out the fire. He's legitimately nice to her, for what is arguably the first time. He's grateful to have her around. Then he runs away without saying goodbye. Jane is broken-hearted and feels like the world's biggest idiot for believing Mr. Rochester had feelings for her. Jane tries to convince herself that she's worthless and she doesn't care about Mr. Rochester. She almost succeeds, but the instant she sees Rochester again, all of her love for him comes pouring back. Jane believes the attempted murderer is a servant named Grace Poole. Grace is paid a lot of money in order to perform a secret job. The other servants are surprised that Jane doesn't know the truth of what's going on. She asks them about Rochester's big secret. Ha ha, I'm just kidding. Jane shrugs off the fact that there's a mystery. It's really none of her business. Did she forget about the fire already? If there's an arsonist living here, Jane should probably find out more. Weeks later, Mr. Rochester returns to Thornfield with all of his rich friends. They have a party that lasts for 2 weeks, then they go to someone else's house to continue the party. It must be nice to be so rich you can party all day, every day, instead of working. One of the guests is the most beautiful Miss Ingram, who is always flirting with Mr. Rochester and getting close to him. For example, they play charades. Miss Ingram uses this as an excuse to dress up as his bride. She giggles at how they were married in front of everyone. Hee hee hee. Jane thinks Miss Ingram is a fake with no original thoughts. She wishes that Mr. Rochester was dating a good woman. Jane takes pleasure in the fact that Miss Ingram seems unable to charm Mr. Rochester. Jane mostly overlooks the fact that Mr. Rochester is shallow enough to marry someone he doesn't like that much, purely for rank and position. Oh, and money. Mr. Rochester is shocked when a foreigner named Mr. Mason arrives. That night, there's a savage cry from upstairs. Rochester lies and says, "Everything's fine, nothing bad has happened." Then he takes Jane to a secret room where Mason is bleeding to death. Jane takes care of Mason's wounds while Rochester gets a doctor. Rochester orders Jane not to ask any questions, and he gives no explanation, beyond implying he made an error in his youth, which haunts him to this day. He is in terror that Mason will reveal what happened and thereby ruin his life. Rochester wonders if he could possibly seek his own happiness in marriage with such a heavy burden on his soul. Jane kind of says no. It's hard for her to judge the situation because she has no idea what he's talking about. Rochester accepts Jane's answer and decides he's going to marry Miss Ingram. This is about the halfway point of the book. If this was a Nancy Drew book, she would have already solved the mystery of the murderer in the attic by now. Jane is summoned to the Reed house to visit the deathbed of Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed reveals Jane has a rich uncle named Jane Eyre, who tried to adopt Jane 3 years ago. Mrs. Reed was still overflowing with hatred for Jane, so she lied to John and told him Jane was dead. I think that's carrying the grudge too far, considering that all 10-year-old Jane did was talk back to Mrs. Reed 8 years ago. Jane offers to forgive Mrs. Reed, but Mrs. Reed rejects the offer. She dies mad about it. Well, that was a 1-month trip, which should have been a brief letter. Jane returns to Thornfield, where Mr. Rochester has made plans for her to get a new job in Ireland. They both admit they don't want to be separated. It feels like they're connected by an invisible string. Jane and Mr. Rochester confess their feelings to each other. He asks her to marry him. He was only pretending to like Miss Ingram in a vain attempt to deny his feelings for Jane. He doesn't love Miss Ingram, and she only cares about his money. In fact, he went so far as to spread a false rumor about his finances, just to see how the Ingrams would react. They more or less kicked him out and called off the wedding. Jane and Mr. Rochester are savagely exultant to finally be together. They tease each other constantly while they make wedding preparations. This section was romantic and cute. They make such a nice couple that I will take back my earlier criticisms of how this is a terrible romance. That said, the master-servant aspect of their relationship is still creepy. There is a month of happy courtship with an unhappy ending. A vampire-like woman breaks into Jane's room in the middle of the night and destroys her wedding veil. Mr. Rochester promises to explain a year from now. "Hey, Mr. Rochester, you're getting married tomorrow. You should explain what's going on to your bride right now." The wedding is interrupted by Mr. Mason. He says Rochester is still married to his sister, Bertha. Mr. Rochester is forced to admit he did marry Bertha about 15 years ago. He's keeping her locked in the attic at Thornfield. Watching over her is Grace's secret job. Bertha is now a violent madwoman, incapable of speech, and as we've seen, she wants to kill everyone. Mr. Rochester gives Jane a full explanation. Once again, things that could have been brought to her attention yesterday! His family and the Masons tricked him into marrying Bertha. They purposely hid the fact that madness runs in the family, and they did not allow him to have a real, unsupervised conversation with Bertha prior to the wedding. Let this be a lesson to all of you listening to this. You should actually talk to someone before you marry them. Rochester is a little vague about how far along her madness was at the time of the wedding. He stood by her for years as she got worse and worse. Instead of sending her to an insane asylum, he locked her up in the attic of his remote property, pretended she never existed, then went on a 10-year world tour, where he sought out 3 mistresses, including Adele's mother. And now I'm back to thinking Mr. Rochester is a terrible person. Jane decides she has to follow law and principle by leaving Mr. Rochester forever. But where does she go? To her rich uncle? Back to Lowood Academy? Does she find another governess job? Or maybe she visits one of the Reed sisters? Those would all be much better, smarter choices than the one Jane makes. Jane spends her entire life savings to get a coach ride to an unknown destination. After 2 days, the coachman kicks her out without her luggage, so now she's in the middle of nowhere with no money or possessions. She walks to the nearest town and starts asking people for a teaching job or maybe some maid work. After 2 days of sleeping outside in the cold and not eating anything, Jane is on the verge of death. She stumbles around looking for a place to die. Fortunately, she stumbles on a remote house belonging to the local priest, St. John Rivers. He and his 2 sisters nourish Jane back to health. By coincidence, the Riverses are members of the Eyre family. They are the cousins Jane never knew she had. Wow, what an amazing coincidence, huh? It is about 50 pages before anyone figures out they're related because Jane uses a fake name. St. John uses Jane's presence as an excuse to start a school for the local girls. Jane enjoys her new life. She inherits £20,000 from her rich uncle and decides to share it with her 3 cousins. Jane assures readers she's been thinking of Mr. Rochester constantly, even if she hasn't mentioned his name in over 100 pages. St. John has love drama because everyone wants him to marry a Miss Oliver while he wants to be a foreign missionary. 6 weeks before he's scheduled to leave, he asks Jane to marry him because he wants a companion on his trip, and he thinks it would be improper to travel with an unmarried woman. Jane refuses because she could never marry a man who doesn't love her at all. They argue at length about whether or not she'll go. Jane prays for a sign, and she gets one in the form of Mr. Rochester's voice. Oh, happy miracle! Mr. Rochester hears Jane's voice at the same time! Jane rushes back to Mr. Rochester. She learns that 2 months after the wedding fiasco, Mr. Rochester's mad wife set Thornfield Hall on fire. She died, while Rochester lost his sight and his arm. Jane helps Mr. Rochester adjust to his new life. He's happy to be with her always. They get married, have at least one child, and he slightly recovers his eyesight. The end. Post-book follow-up. I was unsurprised to learn this book was written in 3 parts. Part 3 is so completely different from the rest of the book, it's almost like it was taken from an unrelated novel about a missionary. I hate to say it, but if I had to make a movie out of this novel, I would cut out 90% of Part 3. Similarly, you can skim through the first 10 chapters of Part 1. They were interesting in their own way, but 10-year-old Jane's life should not take up 20% of the book. In popular culture, the love story with Mr. Rochester in Part 2 is the only part of the book that's remembered. As I indicated in my recap, I was not on board with the Jane Rochester romance until about halfway through. Rochester is a hard character to like, even if you ascribe the best of intentions to his actions. Pop culture also makes Jane and Rochester super good looking, whereas Jane regularly describes the 2 of them as uncommonly ugly. The story is well written, the author is clearly talented. The vocabulary is a little difficult to understand. A lot of words are no longer in use or have changed meaning. I wish I had gotten an annotated version of the text, which explained all the outdated references and translated the French sections. In comparison, A Christmas Carol was written before this book, yet its text is far more accessible to modern readers. I like the dark mystery elements to the story. I kinda wish the book had been darker and leaned more into the gothic romance elements. I definitely wish Jane had more interest in the serial killer who's inside her house. Jane's utter lack of concern on that front totally baffled me. I suppose that the author wasn't sure how to develop those parts without giving away the mystery solution. Much like how, in the 3rd part, Jane and the Riverses go out of their way to avoid discussing their names and families, because such a conversation would ruin the surprise that they're related. This book has racist elements. Most obviously, Mr. Rochester dresses up in blackface twice, once while playing charades and once when playing a prank on his guests. Another racially insensitive aspect to this book is its underlying assumption that dark skin is a sign of moral deficiency. The bad characters, like Mrs. Reed, get described as dark colored. It's my policy to take 5 points off of a book score for bad, racist, or sexist material. That's going to severely hurt this book score, because I would otherwise give it a 3 or a 4 out of 10, one of those two. It definitely has good elements, and I can see why some people have loved this book for about 200 years, but I think half of the book could easily be removed, and I would rewrite the first half of the Rochester parts so he doesn't come across as a villain. And to say the thing that all Jane Eyre fans probably hate to hear, I think Pride and Prejudice is a much better romance novel. I give Jane Eyre a 0 out of 10.